Emily woke with a start, her heart racing in the stillness of her dark bedroom. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. The glowing red number seemed to pulse in the shadows, each second ticking by louder than the last. She wasn't sure what had woken her until her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Groggy and disoriented, she reached for it, squinting at the screen. Her heart stopped for a moment. The name on the caller ID shouldn't have been there. Mom calling. Her throat tightened. Emily stared at the phone, ball rising in her stomach. This had to be a glitch, a cruel joke. Her mother had died 6 months ago. Cancer had taken her, slowly and painfully. And yet, here her name was illuminated on the phone like some sick prank. With trembling fingers, she answered. Hello. The line was filled with static, sharp bursts of it like some distant radio station, barely within reach. Emily felt cold sweat bead at her temples, her eyes wide as she strained to hear. And then, through the crackling, a voice. Familiar. Too familiar. Eily, the voice said, barely audible, but unmistakable. Emily's blood turned to ice. It was her mother. Her voice was weaker than she remembered, as though dragged through the static of the call. But it was her. Impossible but undeniably real. Emma! Emily's voice was barely a whisper. She could hear her pulse thundering in her ears. The voice spoke again, cutting through the static like a whisper carried on the wind. Emily, it's dark here. I'm so cold. Help me. The phone slipped from Emily's hand, clattering to the floor. Her breath hitched in her chest, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Her mom was dead, gone buried beneath 6 feet of earth. She grabbed the phone, fumbling, but the screen was dark. Call ended. The only sound in the room was her own shallow breathing. A chill settled over the room, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones. Emily couldn't move, frozen by the haunting echo of her mother's voice. Her mind spun with disbelief, but deep down, a creeping dread whispered that the call had been real. And whatever had spoken to her, it wasn't her mother. Not anymore. As Emily sat paralyzed in her bed, the air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier. From the corner of her eye, she noticed something, a shadow, tall and unmoving. It loomed in the corner by her closet. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, her eyes playing games with her in the dark. But then it moved. A low creak came from the closet door, slowly edging open by itself, a sliver of darkness spreading into the room. Something was coming. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the closet door creaked open inch by inch. She stared wide-eyed, the shadows within the closet darker than the room itself, as though they swallowed the faint light spilling in from the street lamp outside. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. She wanted to move, to turn on the lamp, to do anything that would chase away the thickening terror that clung to her like a second skin, but she couldn't. It felt as though the very air around her had become dense, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. In the silence of the room, she could hear a faint sound, like the distant rasp of someone breathing. Her eyes darted to the open door. The shadow she had glimpsed earlier was still there, but now it was no longer still. It shifted unnaturally, as though it were an ink blot writhing in the air. A sudden, sharp knock echoed through the room, loud and jarring against the silence. Emily jumped, her heart seizing in terror. The knock hadn't come from the front door. It hadn't even come from the walls of her apartment. It came from inside the closet. For a moment, everything stood still. Emily's mind scrambled for logic, for reason, but none came. The darkness from the closet seemed to spill into the room now, growing thicker, more tangible. The shape and the shadows seemed to become more defined, as though it were stepping out of the gloom. Then she heard it again, her mother's voice. Emily, please help me. The words were weak, distant, distorted by the same static she'd heard on the phone. But there was something else there too. Beneath the familiar tone, something hollow and wrong twisted her mother's voice into a grotesque mimicry. Mom! Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She knew it wasn't really her mother, but part of her clung to the hope that it was, that maybe, somehow, she wasn't truly gone. But the shadow was growing, spreading across the floor, crawling toward the bed with unnatural speed. Another knock, then another, louder, more insistent, rattling the door on its hinges. Emily couldn't breathe. Her body trembled violently as the room grew impossibly cold. She could see her breath in the air, the frost spreading over the window. Her phone buzzed again, vibrating across the floor where she had dropped it earlier. She reached down with shaking hands and grabbed it. The screen glowed, the same name flashing across it. Mom calling. This time she didn't answer. She watched the phone vibrate, the sound drilling into her ears as the closet door now swung fully open with a low groan. The shadow on the floor seemed to rise up, slowly taking form. It was tall, too tall to be human, with limbs that bent in wrong directions, its face hidden in the inky blackness. Suddenly, the phone stopped vibrating. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, a voice came from the closet, low and sickly sweet, an imitation of her mother's voice, but with something else underneath, something cruel. "Why won't you answer me, Emily? Don't you want to see me?" Emily's blood ran cold. It wasn't just her mother's voice anymore. It was something else, something far older, far darker. The figure in the shadows lunged forward. Emily screamed, scrambling backward until her back hit the cold wall of her bedroom. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the shadow surged toward her, its form twisting and stretching with each step. It moved unnaturally, its limbs bending at angles that made her stomach churn. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive, as though every ounce of warmth had been sucked out, leaving only the cold, crushing presence. The figure stopped just at the foot of her bed, standing still. Emily couldn't see its face. Only a deep, impenetrable darkness where a head should have been. The thing loomed over her, its presence filling the space, a suffocating silence pressing in from all sides. She could feel it watching her, though it had no eyes, just the sickening weight of its gaze bearing down on her. A voice slithered from its form, a sickening mockery of her mother's once gentle tone. "Emily, you left me all alone." The voice cracked, breaking into a distorted rasp, each word dripping with malice. "You let me die." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as tears filled her eyes. No, I didn't," she gasped, her voice trembling. I couldn't do anything, Mom, you know that." The shadow's form began to tremble violently, as if the very fabric of its being was unraveling. From the depths of the dark void where its face should have been, a sound emerged, low at first, a guttural, unnatural groan. It grew louder and louder, distorting into something like a scream that echoed in Emily's skull. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to stop the noise. Then, without warning, the shadow darted toward her, moving faster than her mind could process. The air around her grew suffocating, the cold tightening around her throat like icy fingers. Emily gasped, her chest heaving for air as the thing hovered inches from her face. It whispered again, its voice filling her mind. "You will come with me to the dark, where I am." The words echoed in her head, and the room around her began to shift, the walls warping and bending as though they were melting away. Emily's vision blurred. The familiar surroundings of her bedroom twisted into a sickening nightmare. The shadows deepened, swallowing the corners of the room, devouring the furniture, creeping closer. Suddenly, the room was gone. Emily found herself standing in a field of pale, withered grass, the sky above her dark and swirling with clouds. There was no light, only the dim glow of a distant, dying sun that cast everything in an eerie, unnatural hue. The air was still, and the world around her felt wrong, like a place forgotten by time, abandoned by life. Where am I?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. She spun in place, searching for anything familiar, but there was only endless, barren land. From behind her, she heard the familiar static again, the same eerie crackling from the phone call. Slowly, she turned. Her heart nearly stopped. There, in the distance, standing motionless in the dead grass, was her mother. She wore the same white nightgown she had passed away in, her hair limp and matted, her face pale and gaunt. But her eyes were black voids, bottomless pits that seemed to suck in the surrounding light. "Mom!" Emily croaked, her voice barely a whisper. Her mother didn't respond. Instead, she took a step forward, her feet dragging through the brittle grass with an unsettling crunch. Her face remained expressionless, but there was something about the way she moved, like a puppet on strings, unnatural and broken. The wind picked up, swirling around Emily, carrying with it the faint sound of sobbing. Emily wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if the ground itself held her in place, rooting her to the spot as her mother drew closer. Suddenly, her mother's voice echoed across the empty field, but it didn't come from her mouth. Instead, it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a sound carried on the wind. "Why did you leave me, Emily? Why didn't you save me?" Tears streamed down Emily's face as she choked back sobs. I couldn't, I was there, The wind howled, and her mother's form flickered, her face contorting into something monstrous, twisted with rage and grief. Her mouth opened, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "You belong here with me," the voice boomed, distorted and filled with fury. The ground beneath Emily's feet cracked open, black tendrils of shadow curling up around her ankles, pulling her downward. She screamed, struggling against the unseen force, but it was too strong. The earth itself seemed to be dragging her down, inch by inch, pulling her into the darkness. Just as she was about to be consumed by the shadows, her phone rang again, the shrill sound cutting through the nightmare like a blade. "Mom calling." Emily's eyes flew open. She was back in her bed, drenched in cold sweat, gasping for air. Her phone vibrated wildly on the nightstand, the screen flashing with that same curse name. She stared at it, her body trembling violently. The room was silent, but the closet door was wide open. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she sat up in bed, staring at the glowing screen. "Mom calling." The name pulsed on the phone like a heartbeat, filling her with an icy dread. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, to answer. Her hands were shaking too badly, and her mind was still tangled in the twisted remnants of the nightmare she had just escaped. Or had she? Her eyes darted to the closet, the door hanging wide open. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, thick and unnatural, as though it didn't belong to the room at all. It was the same darkness that had pulled her into that horrible place, the barren field where her mother's distorted form had hunted her. The memory of her mother's black, soulless eyes sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The phone stopped ringing, plunging the room into an eerie silence once again. The relief was brief. A soft, barely audible creak came from the hallway outside her bedroom door. Emily froze, her pulse quickening. She strained to listen, every muscle in her body tense. Another creak, this time closer. Something was out there. Her mind raced. She hadn't imagined the nightmare. The presence she had felt, the dark figure in her room, the voice of her mother. It was all real. And now, whatever it was still here, lurking just beyond her door. Emily slid off the bed as quietly as she could, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. She tiptoed to the door, her heart hammering in her chest, listening intently. The house was deathly quiet, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She felt it, the weight of unseen eyes heavy on her skin. Her hand hovered over the door handle, hesitating. Every instinct screamed for her to turn around, to stay in her room where she might still be safe. But something deep inside urged her forward, a compulsion, as though some invisible thread was pulling her closer to the danger. She swallowed hard, then slowly opened the door. The hallway stretched before her, long and dimly lit by the faint light of the moon filtering through a distant window. The shadows pooled unnaturally, thick and swirling as if alive. Emily took a tentative step forward, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The sound echoed unnervingly through the house. There was movement at the end of the hallway. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She squinted, trying to make out the shape, but it was barely visible, a silhouette just standing there in the shadows. She took another step forward, her legs trembling, her mouth dry. She wanted to call out, but fear clamped her throat shut. She knew, deep down, that whatever stood at the end of the hall wasn't human. It couldn't be. And then it moved. It wasn't a step, but more of a shudder, a sudden, jerking motion, like it had been yanked forward by some unseen force. The figure twitched again, then began to shuffle toward her, its movements unnatural, disjointed. As it drew closer, Emily's stomach lurched in horror. It was her mother, but it wasn't the frail woman she had seen on her deathbed. This was something far worse. Her mother's eyes were empty, black pits, her skin pale and stretched too tight across her skull. Her limbs moved as if controlled by strings, jerking and twisting with every step. She wore the same white nightgown, now torn and stained, dragging on the floor behind her. Emily. The voice was a low rasp, sickly sweet, filled with malice. Why didn't you answer me? Why didn't you come when I called? Emily stumbled backward, her back slamming against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure continued to approach, its dead eyes locked on her, filled with an unnatural hunger. Mom, please, Emily cried, tears blurring her vision. This isn't you. You're gone. You. The thing that wore her mother's face tilted its head, an eerie, inhuman smile spreading across its cracked lips. Oh, but I'm here, Emily. I've always been here. You didn't save me, so now I'm going to take you with me. Emily's body went cold. She turned and bolted down the hallway, her feet pounding against the floor as the walls seemed to close in around her. Behind her, she could hear the twisted shuffling of the figure, faster now, its distorted voice echoing off the walls. You can't run, Emily. You're already mine. She darted into the living room, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely twist the lock into place. The air felt heavy, thick with the stench of rot. She stumbled backward, trying to catch her breath, but it was no use. The room felt wrong, the darkness too dense. Then the phone rang again, its sharp tone piercing the silence. Emily spun around, her eyes wide with terror. The phone lay on the coffee table, glowing faintly in the dim light. Mom calling flashed across the screen once more, and with it a cold, sinking feeling took hold of her. She knew she couldn't keep ignoring it. Trembling, she picked it up. Her thumb hovered over the green button. With a deep breath, she answered. Hello? Her voice was barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. Silence. Then, through the crackling static, the voice came again. But this time, it was different, harsher, colder. Emily, it's too late. I'm already here. A loud, deafening bang echoed from behind her. The door she had just locked was slowly creaking open. Hashtag part 5, the final descent. Emily's heart dropped in her stomach as the door creaked open, inch by agonizing inch. The lock she had just twisted into place clicked uselessly against the wood, as though some unseen force was peeling it apart. She could hear the soft, sickening shuffle of footsteps beyond the threshold. Her mother, or whatever twisted version of her, was still coming. Emily's legs trembled so violently she thought she might collapse. Her back pressed against the cold living room wall, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. The door fully opened now, and there it was. The figure stood in the doorway, its hunched form outlined by the faint, distorted glow of moonlight seeping through the window. Her mother's hollow, black eyes fixed on her, the twisted smile still etched into her pale face. Emily couldn't move, her body paralyzed with fear. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and the floor groaned under its weight. Emily, the voice rasped again, that sickeningly sweet tone laced with something far darker, far more menacing. You can't run anymore. I've come for you. Suddenly, all the lights in the room flickered violently, casting strange, jagged shadows across the walls. The air grew thick, pressing down on her like a physical weight. Emily's skin prickled with cold as the temperature in the room plummeted. The breath leaving her mouth in small, visible clouds. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the room, though her mother's mouth never moved. It reverberated in Emily's ears, growing louder, more distorted, until it was all she could hear. Her vision swam as the walls seemed to warp and twist, as if the room itself was bending under the force of the darkness seeping in. The figure stepped closer, dragging something behind it. Emily's eyes widened in horror as she realized it wasn't her mother's nightgown. It was a chain, long, rusted, and attached to something buried deep in the shadows. "I won't leave you again, Emily," the voice whispered, but this time, there were more voices layered beneath it. Dark, cruel voices, speaking in tongues she couldn't understand but felt in her bones. Desperation clawed at her chest. She had to do something, anything, before it reached her. Emily's gaze darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could save her. Her eyes landed on a nearby table, where a framed photograph of her and her mother stood. A memory of a happier time, long before sickness had stolen her mother away. Without thinking, Emily grabbed the frame and hurled it toward the figure. The glass shattered, shards flying through the air. For a split second, the room seemed to lurch, the lights flickering wildly as the figure recoiled. A deep, inhuman hiss escaped its twisted mouth, and the shadows seemed to ripple around it, as if in pain. But the respite was brief. The figure straightened, its movements jerky, unnatural. It reached out one long, bony hand toward Emily, its fingers twisting and lengthening as they stretched through the air. The shadows behind it swirled, becoming darker, deeper, as though the very room was being consumed by the void. "You can't stop me, Emily," it whispered, its voice crawling inside her mind. "You were mine the moment you answered the call." Suddenly, the chain it had been dragging clanked loudly, the sound vibrating through the air. The figure pulled it forward, and with a violent jolt, something emerged from the shadows. A shape, indistinct, writhing, dragged across the floor toward Emily. It looked like a body, but it was deformed, twisted beyond recognition, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Emily backed up, her breath shallow and fast. The room was closing in on her, the air thick with malevolence, the walls seeming to pulse as though they were alive. She had nowhere left to run. Just as the figure reached for her, its grotesque hand inches from her face, something strange happened. The phone on the floor buzzed again. Unknown caller. Emily's eyes shot down to the phone. She hesitated for just a moment, but something deep inside her, some instinct, some primal urge, told her she had to answer it. She snatched the phone from the floor, her hands trembling violently. With one quick swipe, she pressed the answer button. The second she did, everything stopped. The figure froze, its hands still outstretched. The lights flickered once, then went completely dark. The air, heavy and oppressive just a moment ago, seemed to lift like a storm clearing. Emily could still hear the static from the phone, but now it was louder, sharper. Then, through the crackling, a voice spoke. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakably familiar. "Emily, I love you. I'm sorry." It was her real mother, not the twisted, distorted voice that had haunted her, but the voice she remembered, the one that used to comfort her when she was a child, the one that had whispered goodbye in her final moments. Emily's throat tightened, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to leave you." The voice continued, fading with each word. "But you have to let me go now. It's time to say goodbye." The shadows around her seemed to dissolve, the darkness peeling away like smoke in the wind. The figure, that grotesque mockery of her mother, began to fade as well, its form flickering and dissolving into the air. The chain clattered to the ground, vanishing into nothingness. The room was still again. The coldness, the weight of the unseen presence, it was all gone. Emily stood in the center of the living room, her phone still pressed to her ear, her mother's voice a faint echo on the other end of the line. "I love you, Emily. Be free." The call ended with a soft click. For a long moment, Emily stood there in silence, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. The nightmare was over. Whatever had haunted her was gone. The line between life and death finally severed. But as she stared at the now silent phone, the weight of her mother's final words settled over her. It was time to let go.